live right now. I'm here today with Dr. Trent Dougherty, and ironically, I have our names switched, so I'm going to switch those back. I have you abbreviated as Dr. T there. Do you want to go by Trent, Dr. T, Dr. Dougherty? What would you like, sir?
Oh, just call me Trent, honestly.
Okay. I always want to be respectful until somebody tells me otherwise. So.
I appreciate that.
Yes, sir. All right, so there we go. So anyway, everybody, we are here today. We're going to be interviewing Trent, and I've got a whole list of questions for him. And Trent, feel free to just, if there's something else you want to talk about or go on about, that's totally fine. We appreciate you being on here. I didn't realize...
It's my pleasure.
Oh, thanks. I did not realize you had a debate last night also with Skylar Fiction.
Yeah, the aptly named Skylar Fiction, since his head is in the clouds and everything he says is made up.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I've noticed that with a lot of these internet YouTube guys that I should be careful because I don't know their background.
Right.
So I'll be fair and say they could have some sort of degree or, they could be degreed in these fields, but it doesn't appear that way to me. And it's unfortunate.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are good atheist reasoners.
Yeah.
None of them appear to be on YouTube.
Yeah, I've noticed that the only few I've seen on YouTube are guys like Graham Oppie or other guys that are not only well reasoned but civil, I guess.
Yeah, Graham's pretty rare that way. But one of the things I've got coming on Recovering Reason is going to be some interviews with some very high-level professional philosopher atheists, because I'm getting a little tired of dealing with childish shouting matches with internet atheists. And I mean, I'll go toe-to-toe with anybody. I mean, I'm that way. But it's actually bad for my soul, because I'm a fighter, and I start out like really nice and saying, hey, I'm glad to be here. I have a lot of sympathy for atheists who are troubled by the problem of evil. I say all these nice things, and then the guy jumps all over me. And sorry, I just am not constitutionally put together in such a way as to not fight back. And so it's actually bad for my soul to be around people who are going to drag me down and sort of try to provoke my anger.
Yep. I used to be a jiu-jitsu martial arts instructor, and I'd have the same thing. Guys would come in and challenge. Well, they wouldn't come outright and challenge you. They'd ask to grapple and do other stuff, and then all of a sudden you're fighting for your life.
Yeah, right.
And it's like, wait, what? What is going on? And so I'd have to put the hurt on them, and then I'd come home and I'd feel horrible. I'd tell my wife, I feel like I because do I have to do it this way? Do I have to do it that way? And so when I got sort of went back into theology and whatnot and decided, Eric and I God called us, I guess, to do this ministry, it was the same thing. I thought, I don't want to argue with people. I fought in the military. I fought in martial arts. The last thing I want to do now is fight online in a new thing. And so I won't take debates with anyone that, if that's their pattern of behavior, because why? We're just going to, the ball, I can't move it forward. They can't move it forward. You know what I mean? It just sort of stays there static. But
yeah, I gave it three shots. I debated Tom Jump and then Aaron Raw and then this Skylar Fiction guy. And I feel like it's 3 strikes, you're out, guys. Internet atheism is just failing. And so, like I said, I've talked to some high level professional philosophy guys who are committed atheists and with whom I have a good background relationship, so that we can have some real discussion that it's just guaranteed to not devolve into shouting matches. And in fact, one of those interviews is up. It's one I did in the past. It's an interview with Eric Wielenberg, who works in moral epistemology and teaches at DePaul University. And so on my channel, Recovering Reason, under interviews, there's on the interviews playlist, there's the interview I did with Eric Wielenberg. And I think it's a model of how Christians and atheists can be engaged in civil and mutually beneficial discussion.
That's awesome. Yeah, and that's exactly right, because that's what we want to do over here, is elevate the conversation and educate everybody on both sides.
So I used to be an atheist, so I mean, like,
yeah,
it's I can't say nobody should ever have been an atheist.
Right. That's kind of where. Yeah, exactly. Got to start somewhere.
And Lewis, I think C.S. Lewis felt the same. It's not like C.S. Lewis was triggered by atheists. I mean, he he knew fairly well why he was an atheist when he was, and kind of all fell apart. And clearly he argued for theism quite vociferously, but I don't recall him when he debated C.E.M. Joad, and he was forceful at the Oxford Socratic Club, but I think always respectful.
Yeah, and it's funny, you mentioned Lewis. I love reading C.S. Lewis, and particularly what I find very similar between the two of you is your clarity. Both of you can make a point, and unlike some philosophers, and I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus, I understand what both of you are saying. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't that you don't talk about deep philosophical things. That's not what I'm saying. But that your clarity with which you're making your point is very easy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you saying that. It's certainly one of my biggest goals. And I think if there's anything behind that, it's one, that I'm a first generation college graduate. I did not grow up in a world where people were expected to even go to college at all. And I've always enjoyed the non-academic. There's no point during my career in which the academic circle was my main friend circle or whatever. It was always people hunting, fishing, athletics. So my friend circle was more local, bike riders, trail builders, things like that. And so I've always maintained a connection to common folk, so I never felt like I needed to hide in the ivory tower. And I just, so many professional academics are, they were shoved in a locker as a kid or whatever. They're fighting back. They're kind of a nervous mentality.
Yeah.
So it's like it's like this is their identity. Like, I'm smarter than other people. And so if you can explain things, basically, like, if people are getting what you're saying, it's almost like you're not smart enough.
Yeah.
So academics, especially continentals, will lift up Immanuel Kant, as this great genius. I'm like,
yeah,
he's a crappy writer.
Yeah, yeah, a lot. Yeah, it's was it Swinburne, or it was I think it was Swinburne, said his book on epistemology said something about it was told that if you're going to be a philosopher, you need to be hard to understand. I'm very, very much paraphrasing.
Yeah. No, he was. So I also have an interview on my channel, Recovering Reason. I've got at least one interview with Richard, I think two, where I interview him about his early career and his training. And yeah, I mean, there was this mentality of we're just smarter than other people. And you know how it is. You go to the university. Yeah. University folks tend to think university professors tend to think their job is to beat the traditional values out of kids, coming in from country bumpkin parents. These parents are paying tens of thousands of dollars to have basically communist or Marxist professors tell their kids how stupid their parents are. I mean, like, it's such a bizarre system.
Yeah.
Also, I think that's one reason I've always maintained a connection with the ordinary. Also, I taught high school, and when I taught high school, I even taught junior high. I taught Greek and Latin, and being a competitive individual, I didn't just teach it as a party favor. My students competed in the Junior Classics League, and I wanted them to do well. I wanted them to get rewarded. I wanted them to get affirmation for their skills. And so that's a measurable result, right? That's a measurable result. And most of what's going on in academia is there's no measurable results to speak of. So that's another reason. And then the other reason, I've always loved C.S. Lewis. I think he's the ideal. People don't realize he was actually trained in philosophy first. His first degree was in philosophy.
Yep.
He didn't place a job in philosophy because of the intervention of the war. And so he just went back and studied literature and also got top honors in that. But he originally trained to be a philosopher, and is a great philosopher. And I've got anecdotes from some great philosophers concurring with my judgment that C.S. Lewis was himself very good just as a philosopher. One of which is Peter Van Inwagen and I were discussing C.S. Lewis's book, Studies in Words. And it's masterful. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. It's amazing how Lewis. I could go on all day about Lewis. Yeah, he's probably one of the biggest precipices that pushed me into studying philosophy within the last 7 years or so.
Yeah.
And it was when I realized, and it wasn't even with him, I didn't even realize it, if that makes sense, because he was able to communicate things clearly.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until I started studying and I went, oh, you got to be kidding me. Because when I went to study theology originally in the 90s, philosophy, it wasn't really, apologetics and philosophy weren't what they are today, I guess, if that makes sense. At least not in the theological realm. They weren't as, unfortunately, which is sad, because once I started learning those things, I was like, you got to be kidding me, which is why I've gone back for another degree. And what you were saying earlier made me laugh, because I'm thinking in my head, it's like these professors have never had a class in tests and measurements. How to, if that makes sense. I don't know if all colleges teach that the same course, name it the same thing.
Yeah.
But the idea that you need to make, the curriculum testable and measurable, so you know what your students are learning, and so you can drive at a point. It's like they want to make it as complicated as possible sometimes. And
it's all about, it's ego. It's, I'm smart and smarter, and beware. I tell your listeners right now, I mean, as somebody with like too many degrees, Greek, Latin, philosophy, 2 master's degrees, PhD, if some PhD tells you that, like, oh, C.S. Lewis is fine for teenagers and lay people, but he's not a real philosopher, just laugh in their face.
Yep.
Laugh in their face. It's ideas. I don't care what kind of alphabet soup you have after your name. It's about the ideas.
Swinburne, who's a brilliant philosopher, has just a master's, correct? Because at the time he didn't, I'm sorry.
So Oxford has this weird system where you get like an MA, and then after a certain number of years, the degree actually itself graduates. It's kind of it's a strange system. And Richard has, he has certificates. Like the British systems is very different. So he has certificates in economics and theology and all these different studies. But he's fluent in Russian, and I mean, Richard's just one of the most brilliant, the most erudite person I've ever met in my life.
Yeah, he's very, very intelligent. I have a hard time reading him, not because he's unclear, but he can just at times certain papers.
No, I think you're right. I think his books, like he's got the series through the main series, The Existence of God and The Coherence of Theism and Resurrection of God Incarnate. But I do recommend to your listeners these 2 books by Swinburne that are written for a more popular audience. Yes. I do he has worked really hard, and I've read drafts of things for Richard that he's writing for a popular audience, and he's got one coming out on Mind. It might have actually come out already, but he actually takes this. And actually, one of the first things I ever got from that he had written was this. This is going to take you back a little bit. So this is from 1986.
Oh wow! You
don't see those very often.
That's awesome.
That's published by the Christian Evidence Society, and it's a little tract. Evidence for God, and it's fantastic stuff. So Richard actually does have a heart for communicating to the people. But I mean, look, he was born in the 20s, I think, and not the 20s. That wouldn't even be possible.
Well, yeah, he's a little older.
He was born in a different world.
Yeah,
and that sort of world that he was born in has made it, there are language barriers. And so one of the things that I really aim at for the rest of my life is to really translate Richard's work into to transpose it into a more popular key. I've got a series I've just started called Swinburne for Seekers, and I'm going to be going through Richard's works and sort of trying to boil them down into more understandable, comprehensible chunks, because he is, in my opinion, the best philosopher of religion writing today. And in fact, since William Temple, Paley, I mean, I think Swinburne's a once in a 500-year time period kind of person.
Yeah, I'm quite impressed with him. And speaking of books and publications, I wanted to plug some of the stuff you've done real quick to our viewers and listeners, because it's quite good. For those of you that, now this may be expensive, I don't know if they can get your for them the I gotta see which camera I'm on here. What is this? The Oxford Handbook of Epistemology of Theology. I'm reading it backwards on the screen. It's coming out garbage.
Right.
So I got what is that saying? You guys, if you can afford it, this is an awesome book. I don't think they have it in paperback version, which is why it's so expensive.
Yeah, and I tell you what, for your listeners, for your guys, I'll post a PDF of that chapter. I'll send you a PDF, and you can post a link.
Okay.
And
thank you so much.
We'll just I don't think the editors will care about that. They're not losing any money over this, and this book is produced. It's a reference work. It's produced for university libraries and such. So I have no problem sending you PDFs of any of the things we discussed today.
Thank you, brother. I really appreciate that, because that is an awesome paper, and I really liked the clarity with it too. That was one where I was like, man, this is I could sit down and read it, and whatever it takes to read a paper, versus some stuff where I'm like, I gotta look stuff up. This is gonna take a while.
Yeah.
So I might be getting better, but I think it's just that you make it still very intelligent but accessible, which I appreciate.
That's the goal.
Yeah, and there's for the viewers. Listen, there's a trick you can do where I go on Amazon and I'll look at publications like that. I think I've told you all this before, and I'll find my favorite authors that are in this compendium, and I'll just Google the name and the paper, and a lot of times they publish this stuff.
It's on their website.
Right,
yeah.
It's on their website, so that you don't have to purchase stuff if the publishers maybe have done this type of book afterward.
Yeah, and these publishers are making money off of us. I get a check from Oxford University Press once a year for maybe $3,000. I mean, it's like we're not making.
Right.
The authors aren't making anything on this to speak of, and
yeah.
Oxford's a bulk press for academic libraries, so I mean,
yeah,
I'm not worried about their bottom line.
Right, exactly, and yeah, I know what you guys get roughly in a percentage wise, and it would astound people if they knew how little it is.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Another one you did, which is the planning a project, the 24 or so arguments for God. You guys got to check. Awesome. I just got this recently and was looking over it, brother. This is really great. The arguments in here are really cool. It's not just the Kalam, and I love the Kalam, but there's some really cool stuff in there.
Yeah, and it really just shows how, in so many different ways, it's like the world is, woven, and you find all these little threads, and any one of them you pick and follow, you're going to find it going back to God. If you're wondering, like, man, what about propositions? I mean, like, we speak different languages but express the same meanings. There's something in common. How can that happen? And just like the next thing you know, you're like, well, that would, work better with theism than it would with naturalism. And there's so many different ways that happens. And it was a labor of love. Jerry and I are both people who have known Al for a really long time. I met Al in 1990. Oh, wow. So I've known Al for 30 years, and spent a lot of time conversing with him at conferences, pubs, airports, dinners, things like that. And he loves to talk philosophy, and he's a really nice and generous person himself. And I've got 2 interviews with him on my. I've got one of them I can't find, which is embarrassing, but it's an appendix in the 24 book. But I also have an interview with him on the history of Christian philosophy on my channel, Return to Reason. And Al himself says that Richard's work constitutes nothing short of almost miraculous itself in its breadth and depth, its scope and its precision. And even though they come from different approaches, different methodologies, for the most part, Al has nothing but praise for Richard's work.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I mean, we could make this whole thing about all these guys. It's funny how when I read a lot of these guys' work and I see the way they're thinking, I think, yeah, doesn't everybody think this way? And maybe they do. I don't know, but again, maybe not at the academic level with which they're able to present it. But I just mean the desire to want to have clarity and think about all manner of things, why these things are the way they are, or
yeah, because both of them, you can't. The thing about philosophy of religion is you have to be able to do metaphysics, epistemology, moral theory, logic. It's just you can't just the issues are so big. You have to be quite proficient at all the major disciplines within philosophy, and so it's natural that it attracts big minds like these guys, and they're as good as anybody in the field has ever been, really.
Yeah, that whole top row of my bookshelf, and now starting the second one, I have to keep removing books, philosophy and its subdisciplines, epistemology, metaphysics, for that exact reason, because I read these guys, yourself, and they touch on something from another branch, and I'm like, gotta get another book. Yeah, I need more, or I have books, but they're not maybe clear enough, or I don't know, they're just not presented in a way where I can really wrap my head around the material.
This is one reason why I think YouTubing is really a good service, because life has just changed, and I'm not saying it's changed for the better or the worse. I'm just saying it's changed.
Different. Yeah,
it's different, and there, in a way, there's something. Now, this is a bit speculative, and so I want people to take it with a grain of salt. But look, when I was getting my training in Greek and Latin, it wasn't Koine Greek. It was classical Greek. And my specialty was Silver Latin and pastoral poets and the works of Virgil. And so, we got, and we would learn everything, we would start with Attic Greek. So we started with Homer, then moved towards Plato, and then moved forward. And take the Odyssey, probably one of my favorite works of classical literature. So we think of it as as a written story, something you read. But the fact of the matter is, Homer, or whoever Homer stands for, was called the blind bard. These were stories that were told to people over campfires.
Yep.
The same thing with Shakespeare. We think of it as literature, but it's drama that was done on a stage, and there's something in a way actually less natural about treating Homer or Shakespeare as text-based literature than it is to go to an event where somebody tells a story or go see a play. But philosophy is the same thing. I mean, look at Aristotle. Aristotle's school, they were called the Peripatetics, right? Because Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great would send Aristotle flora and fauna from around the world. And Aristotle had this botanical garden, and he would teach us. He would walk around the botanical garden, and discourse and do Q&A, as did Socrates. Clearly, I mean, Plato wrote books, yes, but he was writing based on things he heard. Not that they're literal transcripts or anything, right. But the main and earliest Socratic dialogues are based on things he heard, that he saw and watched. So I actually think the interactive nature of YouTubing is in a way more natural and a return to a more ancient method of communication than books. Yeah. Now, I love books. There's not very, there's these in the background, but there's also a bookcase there and there and there and there.
Yeah.
Not to mention my stacks,
Same way. Yep.
So I'm a bookish person, and I love books, and I'm reading a lot of books right now, and I like taking a book and going and sitting down in a coffee shop and reading it. But it's not the ultimate or only form of expression of ideas, and not necessarily the best either.
Yeah.
Because people are wired, people neurologically and psychologically are wired to respond to the human face, the human voice. And so I think the interactive sort of teaching that takes place on the internet is, in fact, in many ways, an improvement over reading books.
Yeah, I agree with you. And this is why I went back to school. I'm punishing myself doing it again. I've got 10 years of college, and it's like, why am I doing this again at my age? But I thought, going back, I was going to be able to interact more with my professors for this exact reason. Because the books, I know how to read. I know how to do research. I was a researcher for a large church, for the senior pastor there. But I wanted the interaction, so I can do exactly what I can do with you here online right now.
Good luck getting that amount of time out of a...
No way. I've never... Yeah. Only in my undergrad program, because I was lucky enough to be the researcher there, and so I knew all the staff and worked in the main office too. So I would able.
Well, look, I was the same way. When I was in the thick of it, I was so overcommitted, so busy, writing so many things for so many people that, I mean, heck, first of all, you had to catch me there, right? Because I'm flying
Right.
all over the world, giving talks and all over the globe, And it's like, first of all, you got to catch me in the state. Then if I'm really going to be working, I'm going to do it from a coffee shop or home. So you got to catch me in the state and on campus, and when I'm not just running to a class or from a class.
Yep.
And even if you do catch me because I'm in state and on campus, able to pause between things, I'm still thinking, okay, well, I got to get this paper. You're talking to me, but I'm thinking, okay, I got this is due then, and then I got to because I've got editors sending me emails saying, where's our stuff? We need the revisions. Where are the corrections? I had 3 people doing my, copy editing and things like that. It's like running a small business, honestly.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to interact with students more, but I was constantly distracted. And so I think maybe I did a better job than average, but I know I shortchanged students just because the lifestyle does not reward teaching at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So when I would get grants or fellowships or things like that, part of the reward was you don't have to teach. I mean, to start with, as a research professor, I was only teaching 2 classes a semester.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is already not much. And then I get a fellowship and I go to, I went to Notre Dame for a year and didn't teach the whole year.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't even I like teaching.
Right. It's publish or perish too. So you get so involved with all of those things, and like you said, you get rewarded for it, and and it's funny because I get so frustrated going back to school, and it's never been the case that I've had a ton of time with my professors, but even more so is the busy work, the seat work, all that, where I'm like, man, again, I could do this for minus the cost of the book. I can do this for free at home. Yeah. I'd never needed somebody to push me like that. I always wanted the conversation so I could ask questions and so I could get the feedback. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah.
So.
And yeah. I honestly think, for better or worse, the humanities are on their way out in terms of the university. I mean, administrators are eliminating the humanities from the outside. Humanities professors are making mockeries of their own disciplines from the inside. So I think that, and again, that's good in some ways, bad in others, but think about where the university started. It started with guilds that collected around specific people in specific places in the cathedral towns that it ended up becoming university towns because the cathedrals were there, and therefore these certain scholars were there, and the people would collect around them, and then that got some sort of official recognitional status, and then they got a charter as a university. But there's a sense in which we're almost going back to, the system where, okay, find a teacher you like and get their stuff where you can get it on YouTube or wherever. And then what do you need the degree for? I mean, if you have specific goals, that's fine. But you're basically you're buying the degree. You're buying the certificate.
Yep, that's exactly what I'm doing right now, brother. I have no desire. Well, I should be careful. I love the college where I'm at, so I'm not trying to throw them under the bus. But yeah, it's the same thing, and I'm on the fence going, what do I do with this? Because I'm not getting what I need. All I want is the knowledge. I don't care about the degree.
Which, like you said, you could utterly get on your own, no problem.
Yeah, exactly.
But we live in this certification society where...
And that's the problem.
Everybody's got to have a piece of paper that says you can do what you can do, because we've thrown the idea of a meritocracy out because, we can't say some people are better than others, while at the same time sustaining a system full of people who think they're better than others. I mean, it's just...
Yeah,
whatever.
That's it, because I want to publish academically and maybe go back to teach, but I need that.
Which isn't even hard. I mean, it's like once you crack the code, it's easy.
Yeah, and I've taught high school, junior high like you, and then undergrad level. But anyway, yeah. And speaking of which, guys, well, it would help if I had it. Socrates, Socratic logic. Now, this is, you were the editor for this one? Is that correct?
Yeah, so that was what we settled on. There are parts of it that are authored by me, pages. I have an appendix in there on modern logic, and then there would be maybe stretches of a few pages that are written by me, paragraphs. But Peter sent me a manuscript. I went through it really, 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 really carefully. It was a wonderful thing. I loved it so much, and the book has done so well. And both of us are really proud of the fact that so many people have been able to educate themselves in logic using that book.
Yeah, that I got one of my professors had recommended it. That has been one set of good interaction I've been able to have. Is I'll ask them, "What do you recommend?" and I get their book lists, and that's been awesome. There's a few more I want to mention just while I'm on it, and I also want to ask you, brother, your website. Now, guys, if you want to check that out, and I'd recommend you do, go check out Trent's website. It's down in the description. There's a link to that, and I will put links to your other YouTube channels because the only one I have on there right now is Slam Harris.
Yeah, what I ended up doing was making one umbrella one called Recovering Reason, and I'm going to have all the other channels be playlists on that one.
Perfect. Okay, good. And that's
it's taken me a while to figure out this whole, the YouTube thing's very different than academia, and so I realized at some point, like, no, I need, first of all, the website is like, the website should just be point to my YouTube channel. I mean, it's all about YouTube. I will have some of my writings up there eventually, but it's like, right now I'm just not motivated to do that. I'm motivated about interactive content. And so, for the near future, it's all about that YouTube channel, Recovering Reason.
Good, yeah. So I'll make sure to put a link to that and point everyone to it in the future. And so for those of you guys watching now or in the future, which is weird to think about, Recovering Reason, check that out. I strongly recommend it. And I'll get into some of the other stuff. I also wanted to mention, this is another one that can be expensive, although I don't think it's terribly expensive. This is believing in accordance with the evidence, and these are essays, and Trent has one in here, and this is number 398. I know that this is a series in the, is it Senate? The name of the
I actually don't have, it's probably Synthèse.
Yeah, Synthèse, that's it, thank you. Yep.
That's a journal that publishes stuff in epistemology primarily.
Yeah, there's an article in there I wanted to talk about in a little bit, but I have questions because it's really good that you did on is it Reason, Common Senseism?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very, very good. I just want to think if there's anything else. Oh, there was a couple more books. There was Justification, which I am having a hard time finding on. Is there another place to purchase that? That's one you did, correct? On Justification.
That one. The one with Matheson and Rogers and that. Yeah, it's so funny they have that up there. I canceled that contract.
Okay, good.
They like put that up before, and then they never took it down. It's so weird.
Yeah, because it's up, and I'm like, man, I want to get this, but I can't find it.
Just read, honestly, and one of the reasons why I didn't want to do that book anymore was because it was just going to be basically get this because this book exists.
Yep, I have that. I have that right on my shelf.
That one and Richard Feldman's book called Richard Feldman, my dissertation director, has a book, little Prentice Hall textbook, little paperback, but that big, just called Epistemology and Introduction, and it's by far the best epistemology textbook out there. Nothing even comes close to it. And so get that and forget everything else.
Who was I'm sorry, the name again on that one?
Richard Feldman.
Oh, Feldman. Okay. I think I have some of his other stuff. And I also got Something Without a Net. I can't think of that. Was a recommendation you had on it.
Yeah, Working Without a Net. That's one of my philosophical grandfathers, Richard Foley.
Yeah, our viewers and listeners love to read, so that's something whenever there's book recommendations, I'm like, hold on.
Yeah. I can tell you right now, as far as epistemology goes, this is my absolute top pick.
Gotcha. Well, then I'll get back into that one because I've got
my absolute top pick.
My copy looks like yours.
Now, it does presuppose, it might be that Richard Feldman's book might bring you up to a level to where you're going to appreciate this book a little more. I think this book's very well written and pretty understandable, but Feldman's book he can sort of start you from scratch, as it were.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's good for some of our listeners that don't. I had recommended one by, it's not bad, not Will to Believe, I forget what it is. Dew and Foreman wrote it. on epistemology. It's very, 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 very basic. But for somebody who has no philosophical background, I found that one to be, man, for the life of me, one of you moderators can write the name. I'd appreciate it. It's the Dew and Foreman book. I recommended it before, so they know exactly which one I'm lazy. I could just get up and walk over there and find it, but that'll take too long. But yeah, and then you had another one that I have a copy of on evidentialism.
Yeah, evidentialism and its discontents. It's a collection of essays defending evidentialism against all kinds of objections.
And that one's pretty doggone good. I like it. And that sort of brings us into the topic of, I guess, religious epistemology, or just epistemology in general. And brother, again, take this wherever you want. You know what I mean? But I've noticed with your, if I remember correctly, on another channel, I don't remember which one, I think it was JMD, I think it was John's over on JMD Apologetics, where you were talking about the reason for your ministry was, well, maybe I'll just let you speak. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
You mean behind the term
reason?
Recovering reason. Yeah, so it's called recovering reason for a couple of reasons, at least three. Well, at least four. One is that it alliterates, and I love a little alliteration. Another is that I find that the concept of reason itself is one of the most abused and co-opted concepts in the history of philosophy. So on the one hand, you've got atheists taking the concept of reason, twisting it into a bald scientism that basically says if you can't put it in a beaker and titrate it, it's not rational, which is self-defeating and stupid.
Self-referentially incoherent.
Yeah, so it's a perversion of reason. But on the other hand, I have to say that when you have certain factions within Christianity that also pervert the concept of reason. I mean, Martin Luther had things to say about reason that I'm hesitant to even say out loud on your channel.
Oh yeah, I wrote a paper on fideism and quoted him.
Unless you have a bleeper.
No, I don't. But I know exact. Fruda, Herr Fruda. I forget the exact quote in German. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry for my German. We actually have a German viewer. I apologize, sister or brother. But yeah. So yes.
So there is a wing that has been very against reason, that considers any sort of attempt to analyze the faith as a sort of rationalism and sort of prideful and judging God and all this. And it manifests itself in fideistic views where you, quote, just believe, or presuppositionalism. And these are ways Christians have perverted reason as well. Mm-hmm. And I want to take that back and say, no, reason is just as... I thought it was Aristotle, but I can't remember now for sure who it was. I haven't been able to verify the quote, but I remember I read it in high school and I loved it. It was, reason is a spark that God has, a flame that God has kindled in the soul. And Aquinas uses this phrase all the time. He calls it what can be seen by the natural light of reason. There are certain things that can only be seen by the light of faith. That is to say, things that we could very unlikely. Some things we couldn't or probably wouldn't reason our way into, such as the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, there are precursors to the doctrine of the Trinity. In Aristotle, in Book Lambda of the Metaphysics, he talks about God is thinker, thought, and object of thought. Mm-hmm. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting that Aristotle has a sort of triune God, but it's a more rationalistic triune God. And Hugh of St. Victor has an argument for the Trinity from reason about the need for God to have to sort of co-love, and the 3 is the minimum number for that. But let's face it, without divine revelation, without God choosing to self-disclose that he's triune, we're probably not going to figure that out on our own.
Yes, amen. Yeah, that's something we talk about on the channel a lot. As I tell the viewers, look, don't be worried if you express the Trinity in what would be considered a heretical way. Now there I'm talking more about partialism versus modalism or whatever. But why? Because I want them to think through it, to get through it and to think about it, because we don't have it's not like we have a perfect revelation where God handed down a tablet along with the 10 Commandments and said, Moses, make sure everyone understands this. or they ain't getting in. And it describes the formula for the Trinity, where we can all go, oh, okay, great. So we're trying to think through it. So
I mean, 3 persons and 1 nature and all this it's pretty complex in a certain respect. And so there's no reason. Yeah, I agree. Most people's expressions of the Trinity are not the church's expression of the Trinity, but you got to start somewhere and you got to think through it. I was temporarily a modalist heretic after reading Alistair McGrath's book on the Trinity.
Oh yeah, I think I
accidentally. Accidentally, but so Aquinas calls that the light of faith. You see, everything you see is seen in virtue of some light being shown upon it. And so when God, through special revelation, self-discloses, Aquinas calls that is the light of faith shining on this truth. But he also says there is what he calls the natural light of reason, or the light of natural reason. And that is it's natural in the sense that it is a faculty that God has put inside of us that allows us to see certain truths. And this is a multifaceted light. So there is what you might call rational insight, that by the light of which you see things like the transitive property, that if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A is equal to C. Mm-hmm. Well, how do you know that? You just see it, right? You just literally, you hear it and you're like, okay, yeah, that I can totally see that. You can see that no part could be greater than the whole. Right. There are certain logical truths, formal truths, what are other kinds of necessary truths of logic, truths of math. Right. And by the light of natural reason, you just see that they're true. Okay? Right. And so reason is a faculty that God has given us to see things that he has seen fit that we should see on our own. Mm. And as Aquinas says, even some of the things that we can see, it's fitting that God reveals them, because let's face it, for most of history, most people have been spending so much time putting bread and butter on the table, they don't have time to sit around and think about the ontological argument or how to go from the lowly to the most high, Yeah. So it's fitting that the church is our teacher, and that we have giants among us like Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, and I would say, Paley and Swinburne and these other great lights. So I want to reclaim the idea that reason is a gift from God, and that it does not stand opposed to faith in any way whatsoever. That reason is a very broad notion. So that's part of the idea behind recovering reason, is recovering it from atheists and fideists. But the other part is recovering reason is a restoration of sanity for those who've struggled with mental illness or addiction. So I'm a recovering addict, and the concept of addiction is extremely poorly understood in general society, and understood less well within Christian circles. And I really think that leads to a lot of judgmentalism and excluding of people who are hurting and in need of help. And the right way to think about addiction is a loss of reason. The first of the 12 steps is we admitted that our lives were out of control, that we could not that we could not manage ourselves. And so there's a loss of reason, and addiction is not about physical substances. It just isn't. If anybody tries to tell you that addiction is about physical substances, it's neurologically, it's nonsense. Addiction is not about physical substances. Addiction is up here. Some chemicals unleash things up here better than others. Yep. But if you don't have the genetic basis, and if you don't have genetics pulls the hammer, trauma pulls the trigger. Mm-hmm. And so addiction and compulsive behavior and mental health issues take reason away to where you don't even have reason anymore. And so as I try to help other addicts and people struggling with, so I'm diagnosed bipolar, for example, I want to help those people recover reason, which is a sort of self-regulatory faculty that the soul has. Not that we don't want to use the proper prescription medications that our doctors rightly give us, but that we want to do our work. We want to do our work to live sane lives and make sane choices.
Amen. Yeah, that's awesome. In fact, I saw a post you had done on Facebook. I won't mention it right now. It's public, but about some of this, and I thought I wanted to ask you in the future to have you actually come back and talk about that if you were interested.
Yeah, it's tough, but I need to do so. Yeah,
and it doesn't have to be about your story. It can be about helping others.
It kind of needs to be about my story.
It's funny because
if somebody doesn't do it, nobody's. I'll do it.
Okay, and particularly because you and I are in a very similar boat. Believe it or not, I'll leave that as a teaser for that in the future. But very similar. I read that and I went, wow, like that's interesting. That I don't know if it's our generation or what, but very similar in age and exposure and yeah. And I wasn't exposed to it from my home. It was outside the home, but still I was exposed to it quite a bit. So anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then and I wanted to ask a question, and I want to make a correction real quick. What I said about the Trinity, just because I don't want to get crucified for this later,
right,
wasn't that I want people to believe wrong things, or that what I meant was, and I realize you understand what I'm saying, but I don't want to be on somebody else's website tomorrow or YouTube page.
There are people out there scouring for somebody to criticize.
Oh yeah. And I just don't have time for it. And so what I wanted to say was, of course, we want people to believe, orthodox things about the Trinity. All I'm saying is that I want them to feel free to think about it and not to be afraid to make mistakes.
We have to have safe spaces for people to make statements that are wrong.
That's right, and that's exactly what we're trying to do here and tell folks all the time. Be cool. You can say anything you want in the chat as long as you're kind. Attack the argument, not the people. No ad hominems, circumstantial or any of the other type. And really just think through things and not be afraid to make those mistakes, because I feel like all too often, getting back to what you were saying about recovering reason with the Fidius and the some of the presuppositionalists, that people just have to sort of do it because they say it or believe it because they say it, and that to me is just very frustrating. And
yeah, and when people don't feel safe to make mistakes, they do one of two things. They either harbor their errors, right, up here, they keep them to themselves and therefore are never corrected, or they just quit the game.
Yep.
I mean, the world is full of ex-Christians who got fed up with being criticized for everything they said, as if making any kind of mistake made you a bad person. That we got to stop that. And same thing for sin too, right? I mean, we act like, oh my God, a Christian sin? Yeah. What the heck? Get out of here. I'm like,
yep. I used to hate that when I'd hear, as a pastor, I'm no longer pastoring a church, but I'd get so frustrated when I'd hear guys preaching from the pulpit, and they would just talk about like they couldn't understand how anyone would do whatever X was. And I'm going, well, maybe you don't have that problem, but you mean to tell me you have no problems whatsoever where you can't somehow, make the connection? You got to be kidding me.
Yeah. And then especially in these days of social media, it goes insane.
Yep.
People just go nuts.
Yep.
And then it's like you can't correct that. You can't stand there against the social media mob and like say, actually, that's not quite true. It's actually this. It doesn't work. Yeah. And so Christians have a special responsibility as people whose commission it is to carry forth a ministry of reconciliation. Woe be it to us if we create an environment where people are scared to admit their sins, scared to start the road to recovery, fearful of what's going to happen to them if anybody finds out about their sin. Even Socrates, I mean, it was in, oh gosh, I can't think. It'll come to me a little bit later. It's one of my favorite dialogues. I think it's the Gorgias. It's the Gorgias. And they ask Socrates, it's similar to the question in Book 2 of the Republic, but they say, kind of like, what's the worst thing that could happen to a person? And his answer is to do evil. Yep. And so there's you could do evil and get away with it, do evil and get caught. So he basically inverts the values of the world. So the people that he's talking to might be Alcibiades, but it's like, okay, the best situation is to do evil and get away with it. The next best is to do evil but get caught. the next best is to not do evil and therefore not get caught, and the worst situation is to not do evil but be blamed for it.
Yeah.
And that's and Socrates points out, it's like the exact opposite. It's like the worst thing that could happen to a person would be to do evil and not get caught.
Yep.
And they just think Socrates is crazy, right? But these days, it's like the Christians are the ones that have the pagan mindset, and we need a Socrates to say, no, your values are inverted.
Yeah.
The person who commits sin, even willfully commits sin, is in a sense something very bad has happened to them. They're failing to flourish in a way that is pitiable. And so if you read like one of the new series I have coming out on Recovering Reason is I'm going to do some exposition of these prayers of Aquinas, and the first one I've done, I got a lot of editing to do this weekend, is on Aquinas' prayer for the forgiveness of sins. And, this is, to you, O God, fountain of mercy, I come a sinner. You can't, can you say that on Facebook today?
You get crucified. No
people
pun intended.
Savage you. Yeah. So we got to somehow come up with a way for people to get help without fear of being destroyed.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, there's so many things. I suffer from PTSD, and I'm not afraid to say it. And that came from my military experience. And a lot of guys wouldn't. The stigma is so negative nowadays, and whatnot. Now I've been dealing with it for almost 15 years, and so I now know how. But it took me a long time, and part of it was just because even though I was going to get help, there was such a negative stigmatism attached to it that I wasn't really. I don't know. I'm not sure what the right word is there, but I really wasn't really following. I guess the advice might be a good way of expressing that. And I didn't want to do the things to get better. It's not that I didn't want to be better. I guess I was just, I don't know. It's kind of hard to express. But
it is, and it's like a mystery. And this is part of why people need to have compassion for people that are suffering through mental challenges and even habitual or compulsive sin. Because like you ask for an account of it, and you're like, I'm just as flabbergasted by it as you are.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean,
if I had an answer, I wouldn't be doing this. I mean, it's like
right, exactly. And
I don't understand it. I mean, and of course, who said this better than anybody else? Paul, right? Romans 5: the good that I will to do, I do not, and the evil that I will not to do, I do. Who can save me from this wretched body of death? I mean, he understood it. And those are, I've never read words other than Paul's there that better express what it's like to suffer from any kind of compulsivity.
Yeah, he's chapter 6, 7, and even some into 8 there, where he just gets into all this. And Romans is one of Eric and I's favorite books, and we started memorizing it. I got through chapter 1, and I was like, "Yep, okay." She's on like chapter 11.
5 to 10, from 5 to 10 is just amazing.
Yeah, and then 12. I'm doing a series. In fact, I was just doing a Greek word study on 12, I don't know where it is, on sanctification and whatnot, and I was going through all the Koine Greek in there and translating, because I want, we've got plenty of good translations, but you know how it is when you want to do your own word study so you can really understand what's going on in the underlying text there. And I was making sure everything was in agreement, and you understand that from the language perspective.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And man, it's just so much fun to do that, and just to read what Paul's saying and really getting at with how we should behave, how we should renew our mind, and in these things that he's getting at, and it's so important. It's funny because you said something in another broadcast recently where I was like, man, I need to keep myself more balanced, where we don't just want to be philosophical or just be thinking about philosophy, but we want to be meditating on God. These aren't your exact words, and I went, man, I need to get back to that. So I pulled out Brother Lawrence's book on practicing the presence of God, I think.
So good.
Yeah, excellent book.
And those of us that love apologetics, there's a natural tendency to be drawn towards a kind of rationalism that can neglect spiritual disciplines. And fortunately, I've had some people in my life that have helped me refocus on that. I got a book around here somewhere. It's just out of reach. It's Dallas Willard.
Oh yeah, Willard's
Renewing. Yeah, it's just can't quite get there. But it's like it's called the Renewing the Mind or something like that. A friend of mine gave me that, and it's really great. And book by J.P. Moreland on anxiety, and I think we're on the cusp of evangelicals starting to realize that the spiritual, we got to go back to the spiritual disciplines, and if you're ever very far away from them for long, something's going to go wrong.
Yeah, you get out of sync. Yeah, or out.
And that's coming from a guy who loves pure logic. I mean,
oh yeah.
When the graduate classes I had on pure logic were so heady and so intense. I mean, it was just like unbelievable.
Yeah.
Transportive for me. I mean, I just loved it. Hardcore logic.
Yeah.
Stuff that's hard to even begin to explain, the complexity of it. But it was awesome. I loved it. But you know, if I spend too much time in that headspace, it's going to come to predominate. And that's literally true, because one of the nice things about what we're finding out about neuroplasticity is the ability to rewire. Mm-hmm. But the flip side of that is, hey, guess what? You have literal mental ruts because of the ways in which the brain stores transmittive materials and neurotransmitters closest to the neurons that fire most. So these mental habits, we can attach like literal distances to how deep a habit is. And so when we renew our mind, when we become transformed through the renewal of our mind, part of what's going on there is literal brain rewiring.
Yeah.
But it's extremely difficult because it is significantly easier for the brain to think familiar thoughts than it is to think different thoughts. So the good news is, once you start thinking with different patterns, the brain will in fact move those neurotransmitters over closer to those different neural paths. And so then it will become easier. And it's like, if you can just break through that barrier, there is some degree of relief and recovery on the other side. And so I know people that have made really significant recoveries and got their reason back, got their sanity back.
Yeah, that's so funny you say that, because when I was going through Romans 12:1 and 2 and translating that, I was finding that most of the English translations don't do it. Of course, it's always going to be the case. You know this. It didn't really do it justice on how to really. I don't want to get too deep into it and get too far off track, but didn't really do it justice because Paul says this about renewing the mind. Don't be conformed to this world, and whatnot, and then sort of launches into talking about how to behave, if that makes sense. So he goes sort of from this mental state right away to physical.
Yeah, he goes to a pretty practical list of things to do or don't do.
Yeah, which I love, but I was like, man, but wait a minute, but what do you mean? I mean, are you just saying that that's the connection, or is there something more? Well, of course, when I looked at it in the Greek, I was like, no, okay, yeah, there's a little more here. But particularly with the word plays, the way he's using certain words and the way I think they interplay with one another. But kind of going back to what you're saying about the way the mind works, is it makes perfect sense in the way we are to change the way we think fundamentally, and some of that I think is by doing certain things, stopping certain habits. Now it's not perfect. In other words, what I mean is, if I wanted to stop, let me think of a good example here. Looking at porn, if that's a problem, just telling somebody stop doesn't
pointless.
Yeah, it's pointless.
Does nothing.
That does nothing.
In fact, it's negative. It has a negative effect, because the judgment creates shame, which drives the activity deeper in hiding, which creates more shame, and it perpetuates the cycle.
Yep. And for me, when I had a problem with it, I had to literally create a stop in access, which helped. And then once I broke a habit, and this is a long conversation that it needs to be hashed out later on, for about 31 days, I found that then it was much easier because part of it was habitual. Not all of it, but I mean, part of it was habitual. When I was able to break that connection, it helped me out
absolutely.
a lot. So anyway.
Yeah, and people find that you go 30 days, have a slip up, 60 days, relapse, 90 days. It really is, from what I've observed, you get the ball rolling, and each time you make greater success, and each time it gets easier.
Yeah, and what Paul says is that I forget about the things in the past. I look forward to things, in the future. Getting into so we're off topic. I'm enjoying this, but I apologize to our viewers. I'll get into some epistemology now. I'm trying to think of a good segue for this. As far as epistemology goes,
what is evidence? You say? I'm glad you asked.
Yes. What is evidence? What would you consider?
So I mean, I'm associated in print with this view called evidentialism, and unfortunately the term has been used in different and incompatible ways. One of the things that the term evidentialism got used to name a view that said basically your religious beliefs are not rational unless you can present a tight set of evidence for them, unless you can give arguments where there's premises and it has that as a conclusion. Well, that's definitely not the case. There are other ways to come by rational religious belief. One of them is by testimony, is by hearing it from other people who are reliable sources. So you don't necessarily have to be able to have to reason through everything yourself. Secondly, not only that, but you don't even have to, even if you can reason through it yourself, you don't have to be able to verbalize it necessarily. So we are called to be ready to give a defense of the reason for the hope give a reason for the hope that's in us, but that can come in a lot of different ways. And failing to be able to meet that lofty goal does not equal one's own belief being irrational. Let me say that again. Even if you don't, so it is a biblical goal to be able to state a reason for the hope that is in us. Nevertheless, if you fail to meet that biblical goal, that doesn't make your personal belief irrational, because you can sometimes our verbal reach exceeds our mental grasp. Sometimes you can get something, but you're not really in a position to teach it. Now, as we all know, when you're teaching something, that really shows a new level of grasp of it. Mm-hmm. But just because you can't teach it does not mean you don't understand it.
Yeah.
You can understand something without being able to teach it. There's an elevated level of understanding that allows you to teach it, but you can still basically understand something pretty well without necessarily being able to articulate it yourself.
Right. So Bloom's taxonomy it's fallible in that sense.
Yeah. I love that, actually. I did teacher training to teach Socratic reasoning and Socratic method in class to classical school teachers, and I used Bloom's taxonomy for that all the time. Yeah. So that's not what I mean by evidentialism. What I mean by evidentialism is something less restrictive. It'll sound restrictive, but I'll say in a moment how it's less restrictive than it sounds. The basic idea, you could formulate it in lots of different ways with degrees of carefulness, but the basic idea is you don't believe anything without adequate evidence. It's just that simple. And notice that we're all evidentialists in everyday life. Somebody comes in and says, so there's a complication here, because we do tend to believe what people tell us, right. And that's reasonable because people telling you something is evidence that it's so.
Yeah, it's perfectly acceptable in a court of law.
Yeah, it's called testimonial evidence.
It's actually considered, people don't realize testimony is actually considered very good evidence in a court of law. Yeah,
it's a subcategory, and somewhere around here, I've got like I've got a book from law school.
So do I. I get a bunch
on the legal aspects of the weight of testimonial evidence, and that goes way, way back. That goes back to Roman law, where they would say things like a senator's word is worth 2 times that of a plebe. But look, if you could get 3 plebes, then that could tip the scales towards them away from even a senator. And then the Catholic Church adopted a similar system where, a bishop's testimony counted more than a priest, counted more than a parishioner's, and they whether you agree or disagree with the weightings, there was a sense there that, okay, testimony gives you reasons, and it can give you different levels of reasons in different situations. And so when somebody comes and tells me, like my son comes in and says, dinner's ready. Okay. He has testified to a proposition that dinner is ready, and his testimony constitutes evidence for that proposition. Now, in that context, it's perfectly sufficient evidence to basically abandon all question. I'm not gonna ask for any further evidence. Okay.
Right.
Now, if he comes in and tells me, my engine is only firing on 7 cylinders, right, I'm thinking,
how do you know that?
Now, yeah. Now, notice here though, the reason isn't that I necessarily need to have some track record. It's not that this is very subtle.
Right. It's not his trustworthiness.
Yeah, what it is I've got additional evidence that he's in a category of lacking the ability.
He doesn't have access
to discriminate that, right?
Yeah.
So, so that's how it goes. So I don't want to create the impression that testimonial evidence is only counts when you are in possession of background reasoning that explicitly says, okay, this person can be trusted here. No. Just the very fact that somebody's testifying to a proposition is itself at least some evidence in any given context. So we got to look at the context carefully to determine how much evidence it is. Furthermore, we can distinguish between what we might call the ordinary usage of the term evidence and what we might call basic evidence. So in a court of law, somebody might say a bloody knife is evidence, or some fingerprints are evidence, and that's a perfectly fine way to talk in that context, but really, technically, that depends on something else. Depends on something more fundamental, which is sense perception. Okay, so it's really the evidence isn't the bloody knife, because they're going to test. I worked in an association with a crime lab for a while, and they don't just have a cop pick up, it looks like a bloody knife, let's enter that into evidence. No, they send it to a lab, and the lab tests it and certifies that it's in fact blood. And then now let's take it a step further. What is that scientist actually doing? Okay, he's taking a sample, he's putting it under a microscope, and he's looking in the microscope. And what's happening then? He's seeing certain things. He's seeing certain patterns, right? So really, our idea that the bloody knife or the fingerprints are evidence goes back to somebody's experience, and a combination of their experience and somebody else's testimony, because he learned in crime school or whatever, whatever kind of training he had. He learned somewhere in his forensics training that blood under a microscope looks like this, or whatever this test is, right? He learned that from somebody. It's not like he recreated that or came up with that by himself. So it's a combination of testimony and his own actual sense perception.
Yeah.
But we have not just sense perception. We also have, like I said before, rational insight. We have memory. We have introspection. And that's how I come to know that I believe certain things or want certain things or feel certain ways. These are all what we might call fundamental faculties of reason. And I hold this view, this version of evidentialism called reason's common sensism, that says anytime a fundamental faculty, whether it be sense perception, rational insight, memory, introspection, or whatever fundamental faculty there might be, if there's a sensus divinitatis or maybe it was Hugh of St. Victor that called it the oculis contemplationis, the eyes of contemplation. A lot of religious thinkers have posited a basic sense of God.
Yep.
And there's nothing mysterious, but it's no more mysterious that we should have a basic sense of God than that we should be able to represent a certain structure of molecular surface as a certain phenomenal quality, like green, right? Is whether a surface comes across as orange or blue, it comes down to the molecular structure of the surface and how light waves are reflected and refracted off of that, goes through my makes a retinal image, is interpreted in the visual cortex, and then comes just the raw experience. Okay?
Yeah.
That's more mysterious to me. It's more mysterious to me how different colored objects with different molecular structures can cause different but systematically consistent experiences in my imagination than it is that I could have a basic perception of God.
Yeah.
All basic faculties are going to be a little bit mysterious by their very nature because they're basic. But it's not like sense perception's more mysterious than there being a sensus divinitatis or an oculis contemplationis. And like, think about, most of our moral knowledge comes through conscience. You just see that torturing babies for no reason is wrong. Nobody needs to teach you that. You can't put that in a lab. You can't that's just something you know. You know it just as surely as you know this is red. And the same in our rational insight, that I know that if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A is equal to C. You can't prove that through some separate means, or like modus ponens. So in logic, the most basic kind of reasoning.
P, then Q. P, therefore Q.
Right. So that and the transitive property are basically the two most basic forms of reasoning. But you can't prove that because by definition, anything you did would, guess what, be in the form of modus ponens.
That's right.
And so there are certain basic truths that must be accepted through basic faculty of grasping it. Logic, sense perception, perhaps God's existence itself, perhaps other spiritual truths, the contents of our own mind, what happened in the past. And so reason's common sensism says that, okay, whatever any of these basic faculties tell you, you've got a reason to believe them. How big of a reason depends on context. And these are what philosophers will call pro tanto reasons. They're a reason to some extent, okay, to some extent. How much depends, and they can be outweighed. So I can think that this shirt is blue, but then learn that the light has a blue shade on it, and then, covered up, oh, this shirt's white. Who knew, right?
Yeah.
So reasons can be outweighed. It's like in medicine and in law, we all watch these medical shows and legal shows, and the evidence will stack up and lean in favor of A doing it, or of this being the malady or the disease. Oh, and then guess what? There's some point in the show where they get new evidence that tips the scales the other way, right? So this is what philosophers call non-monotonicity, and it's reasons stack up and they can outweigh, and the system can be dynamic and it can change in one time versus another. And so evidentialism says, whatever the strength of your reasons, when you add up all your reasons on the scale, the confidence of your belief should match that exactly. That you should never give any proposition a bonus over and above the support that it gets from the rational support that it gets from the reasons you have. But again, just to tie up this part of the package, the reason why that's not super restrictive of a form of rationalism is because any sensible theory of evidence is going to include your basic experiences. And there's no a priori limits on what that could include, including that it could be a basic experience of God himself.
And if I remember correctly, that held a sort of reason's common sensism held a sort of indefeasible isn't the right word, but seems to be part of the formula. So it seems to me that I'm perceiving that the book is read, or am I remembering that correctly? I'd have to go back.
So I mean, there's lots of different terminology you could use for it, but if it at a basic level something seems you to be the case, that you can't go any deeper than that.
Right.
I mean, I can learn that the reason it seemed orange to me was because of orange gels on the lights, and that can be overturned. But fundamentally, if something seems to you to be the case and there's no other interference, that's all you got. That's the at the foundation, those experiences of things seeming to be a certain way are all you have. If I can taste something and it can taste like sugar, and you can later prove to me it's like aspartame or whatever, fine. But right. I still know what I experienced, and I know that I experienced sweetness, and it seemed to me to be sugar. And if it seems to you to be sugar, and you have no concept of aspartame, you're not familiar with the notion of sugar substitutes, then you have reason to believe that sugar, and it's exactly what you should believe.
And that's that pro tanto that you were talking about there, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it's not like once you get a reason, you can never lose a reason. Reasons can be lost, they can be overturned, they can be outweighed, but anytime something fundamentally seems to be the case, you at least have a reason for that. And people call that subjective, but guess what? We all start from within our own experience. There's no other place you can start. The world itself is known through the medium of experience. We are subjects. We have minds. And so we experience the world through the medium of our mind.
Yes.
I look out my window. I see a tree. Well, what does seeing a tree amount to? It amounts to wavelengths of light bouncing off the surface, going through my pupil, hitting my retinal image, translated in the visual cortex to what? To an image.
Yeah.
To an image. All knowledge of the external world is mediated through experiences. Now, let me make a quick distinction here.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that what I'm knowing are these experiences. I'm saying that the experiences are the means by which we know the external world. And there's a big difference. And Mortimer J. Adler, in the old language, you would say the experience is the quo, not the quad. It's the that by which we know, not that which we know. So I'm not at all saying that all we know are our own experiences. I'm saying that all we know comes mediated by our experience. Yeah, and there's no getting out of that.
It's interesting. When I tried to explain internalism to somebody once, I was using this, I think it was Eric and I talking about it, and this is sort of moves into idealism too, maybe a little. But anyway, and I was explaining that when I wake up in the morning and I see her, I don't just experience her directly. I experience her through that same process in my mind, and it's based on all the knowledge and experience I have of her, all those different things I'm accessing. Because if I was experiencing her directly, I may not recognize her without all that, if that makes sense, experience and all that other phenomenon going on in my mind. And there are brief times in my life when, for me anyway, I've experienced somebody where I see them in a new light, because for whatever reason I set aside all that, those experiences, if that makes sense. I realize this isn't exactly what you're saying. I'm just trying to sort of correlate it to what I was thinking to see if I'm understanding you correctly. Am I on the right path there?
Well, look, I mean, our perspectives on things, the way things appear to us to be, can change over time. And when those appearances change, our beliefs ought to change with them.
Makes
so
sense.
If I see a bird out there, or if I see a flying object, and I think, oh, look, a hummingbird. Why do I think that? Because it appears to be a hummingbird. I mean, it's like I've got a recognitional pattern. I have a memory of seeing pictures of hummingbirds. It says hummingbird down there. I have memories of other people pointing to this sort of thing and saying hummingbird. And those experiences, together with this perceptual experience, make that appear to be a hummingbird. But then I can look a little closer and I can go, wait a second, actually, no, that's a hummingbird moth. Because hummingbird moths look a lot like hummingbirds, as indicated by their name.
Yeah.
And this flowering bush right outside my window sometimes hosts hummingbirds and sometimes hummingbird moths. And so if I notice something, if the state of my appearance changes, if it's whether it's a subtle change in its behavior, its angle, its flight pattern, whatever it is, if it changes its appearance in some way, then that can cause a cognitive shift where I go from, oh, not hummingbird, hummingbird moth. Then the same thing can happen in much less mundane ways, where somebody could appear to us to be a good person or a bad person, or appear to us to not like us, or appear to us to like us. And then something causes us to see them in a new light, and they appear differently than they did before. Well, then our belief ought to change as well.
Yep. Yeah, which I'm sorry for. I hope I didn't interrupt you and throw the whole thing there.
No, that's right where I was going.
Yeah, that's perfect, because it seems to me that, and I love the way you're. I need to study Bayes' theorem more, Bayesian theory. Is there any books you would recommend on that?
Yeah, I mean, to keep going back to it, this one's
Swinburne's
pretty
will cover it.
pretty good. But I think there's a really good introduction to probability reasoning is Ian Hacking's book. Ian Hacking is his name, and I think it's called like an introduction to probability or probability and introduction or something like that. There's a book by a guy called Brian Skirms called Choice or Chance. And in, I think, the current edition of the logic textbook called The Power of Logic, it was originally by C. Stephen Lehman, and then it was taken over by some of his colleagues at Western Washington University. I think Dan Howard Snyder and maybe Francis Howard Snyder are on it now. I think maybe Wasserman's on it now. But the book is called The Power of Logic, and it's got a great little section on probability, or at least it used to.
Awesome. Thank you for those. And the reason I'm asking is because, for those that wondering, where's the connection, Sean? Where are you going with that? I think Trent knows what I'm thinking there. Does that play into this, in understanding these probabilities in the sense of I guess, on a deeper level?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm about to do some videos on introduction to probability theory.
Sweet.
And introduction to probabilistic reasoning. I taught a popular class on it at Baylor that got, I think it came down to the fact that I use a lot of multicolored pens, and I'm very visual, and so I represent probability theory through these multicolor visualizations, and I'm going to go ahead and bring that to YouTube as well. But the fundamental idea of probability is the idea of a balance beam. Okay? All of it comes down to the notion of a scale. And so when I get the more reasons you stack up on one side, the firmer that it tilts. So imagine an indicator at the middle, and then you put more weight on this side, and it points that direction. Well, you can have a dial here, and on a real scale, it gives you weight, but on the epistemic scale, it gives you probabilities, right? And so the basic idea behind probabilistic epistemology is just to weigh reasons, to not just think about is it true or is it false, but how likely is it to be true and how likely is it to be false. So something that really bothers me a lot in the world of apologetics and the things that get said and replies that are missed is that in a deductive argument, so let's take the most basic version of the Kalam argument, everything that begins to exist as a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, okay? Right. Very simple, A, B, B, C, A, C, super simple, right? Right. Well, here's a fact about deductively valid reasoning. So a deductively valid argument is an argument such that just in virtue of its A, B, B, C, A, C form, cannot give you a false conclusion if the premises are true. So once it's of that form, once you've determined it's of that A, B, B, C, A, C form, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. It's literally impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. And this can be shown with a Venn diagram. It's physically impossible to put an A circle in a B circle, then put a B circle in a C circle, and not end up with an A circle and a C circle, right? So some of these logical impossibilities can be illustrated by physical impossibilities. So then the question just becomes, are the premises true? And what I find is people come up with objections to the premises and then just go straight from that to a rejection of the conclusion. But that's not very subtle, because maybe an objection isn't a refutation. And so here's an interesting fact about deductively valid arguments. The improbability of the conclusion is the sum of the improbability of the premises. Okay?
Okay.
So this is a theorem of the probability calculus that's not that hard to prove, and it's that the improbability of the conclusion is the sum of the improbability of the premises. Okay, so that makes sense. So suppose you've got two premises, and suppose you're 90% sure of both of them. That leaves 10% doubt at the end. Sum those up, and you've got 20% doubt in the conclusion. Now, you may have that's at a minimum. Now you may add other arguments, and to the extent to which they're independent, that probability can go up. This is about within an individual argument. One of the arguments in the 24 Arguments book is by one of my best friends, Ted Poston, and it's called The Argument from So Many Arguments. And
I like that.
The beautiful thing about probability reasoning is it gives you a way to sum up. So the probability of rolling an ace on one roll of a single fair die is 1 in 6, right?
Right. But
the probability of getting one on 2 rolls of a single fair die, or if you roll 2 dice at once, the probability of getting a single ace is 1/3. You exactly double your odds because you exactly double your chances, right? So probability reasoning has this great feature that you can sort of manageably add up and balance the equations based on how many different reasons you have. And so you can have multiple arguments for the same conclusion, and to the degree that they're independent, they sum up. And they can sum up quick, because add 3 fair dice and 4 and 5 and 6, and it's going to start becoming improbable that you don't get an ace with each roll of 6, right? So now this is long range relative frequency. So you're not guaranteed to get an ace on every roll, but you're like, if you're flipping a coin, you in 20 flips, the odds are you're going to have a run of 5 or 6.
Okay.
But as time goes on and you average, that average is going to converge on 0.5. Okay? So it gives you a way of estimating your best guess. And that's all we can do as fallibilists, as human beings. That's all we can do. And so we have this standard for arguments. Sometimes it seems to me in apologetics, like if there's anything you can say against a premise, well, then you can just scrap the argument.
Right.
No. The question is, how confident should you be in this? Because so take like a Bertrand Russell objection to the causal argument. So you can get the audio on YouTube. Bertrand Russell debated Father Frederick Copleston, very famous historian in philosophy on the existence of God. Copleston gave basically a Leibnizian first cause argument, and Russell was like, well, my physics friends tell me that some things can arise without a cause at the quantum level. Okay, well that's nonsense, but look, my point is this: even if it were, when somebody says something like that, it's not like, oh, okay, therefore the premise, everything that begins to exist as a cause, is just gone. Right? First of all, you have to back up the claim. You say, well, how certain can we be that at the quantum level there's true acausal indeterminacy? How confident are you of that? Because if you're less than fully confident of that, then you can less than fully reject. You have a less than full right to reject that premise. Also, okay, well, maybe the quantum level is some sort of weird exception, but unless you have reason to believe that the world is itself some sort of weird quantum event, well, then guess what? The premise really hasn't been touched. You might say, okay, well, there are some exceptions, so I should lower my credence from basically certain to, I don't know, 0.999. I mean, after all, it's one exception in all of known science and nature. So why should that utterly undermine the premise that okay, fine. Change it from everything that has a beginning, everything that begins to exist as a cause, to, very nearly everything, because everything with one exception does. Well, guess what? Now that your improbability of that premise, your doubt in that premise is like less than 1%, well, then you sum that up and your conclusion is still going to be way above 99%.
Yeah, because we don't want to attribute, because something happens to the part, that it must be the case that it happens to the whole. We don't want to go down that road and say because at the quantum microscopic level maybe this occurs, then it has to occur, as a part.
There's a big difference between saying there is a part of the world where maybe, and I don't buy this for a second, but I'm just saying, suppose it were true. Suppose you could somehow, how I don't know, but suppose you could somehow prove that it really truly was spontaneous events with no cause whatsoever.
Right.
Not that I believe that for a moment.
Right. No, I'm with you.
You'd say, okay, well, here's this one weird part of the world where sometimes this happens. All right, what's that got to do with the beginning of the universe? You know, unless you can articulate very clearly a view according to which the universe is itself some sort of quantum event, which is where some people go, and it looks desperate and it looks silly in certain respects. You know,
it really does look ad hoc, if I can say it that way, because it seems to try to salvage the argument by creating a sort of almost not quite nothingness or
exactly.
Yeah, and I'm not buying that either. Same thing.
The old debate between Quentin Smith and Bill Craig, called Atheism, Theism, and Big Bang Cosmology. Mm-hmm. It's just unreal. Quentin Smith says like the cause of the universe is nothingness or something. I mean, it's just like, get real, man.
It's got to be consistent, I guess, to do that. I mean, you know, but
this is the lengths to which people will go to try to preserve their beliefs. That, okay, we find this one realm where maybe there's an exception to the causal principle, quantum realm. Okay, well, we better get the world in that realm.
Yeah.
So that we can say it doesn't need a cause.
It's funny. I wrote a paper on evidence. I'm going to send it to you if you don't mind to have you look at it. Dealing with all these sort of objections. It's not evidentialism, but and when at the end, when you look at all the evidence we have for Christianity, it boggles my mind that if somebody wanted to dismiss a piece here, a piece there, whether I accept that or not, it seems very ad hoc, because they have to keep hand waving to dismiss all the evidence, to dismiss all the testimony. Federal rules of evidence do not allow for anyone to dismiss testimony in the court of law just because the person is a Christian. They're not allowed to do it.
Yeah.
In the same way, we wouldn't allow that, in philosophy. We wouldn't. So, and just the paper goes to show how all these disciplines have the same. And then for some reason, this is coming to mind because your debate with Aaron Ra, where people want to then sort of hold the extreme scientism and then say, I need it to be measurable in a test tube. It's like, yeah, but, and your debate with Tom Jump, you pointed this out. It's like, but you still have to, on some level, you still have to rely on testimony. Science relies on testimony.
Science relies on testimony.
Philosophy, mathematics. There's all these different fields that it's not just solely. It just boggles my mind.
Nobody's reinventing the whole discipline every time they publish an article.
Right.
You look at the bibliographies in these scientific articles. They're massive.
Yeah.
And you know what else is massive? The list of authors.
Yep.
Because these lead authors, as they say in the STEM disciplines, are depending upon these lower guys, whether they be postdocs or grad students or assistant professors, or sometimes they're people in other countries, and they're like, okay, I need the eigenvalue, calculate the eigenvalue. And then that team does that and they email it over, and it could be to the subject level, eigenvalue equals whatever. And then they plug that into their equation. Well, guess what? They didn't check it.
Yep. They might not even know how.
Somebody else.
Yeah, exactly.
And there are times when, I know people who have told me this personally, where they have co-authored mathematical papers and said, yeah, I don't really know what the paper's about. I don't really understand it because I haven't really thought about it that much. I just proved this theorem, and so I became a co-author. It's like,
yeah,
what the heck? And there's some theorems that can only be proven with computers, like the four-color theorem. I'm like, what do you do then? You're just trusting the computer to get it right. Yeah. It's just, you don't even know what the computer's doing necessarily to come up with this answer, but you figure whoever programmed it does. So there's tons of testimony. Science is just shot through with testimony, science and law, these rational disciplines. And medicine. It's just all, everywhere else in life we have a little more calm, rational epistemology where we understand the importance of the social aspect of testimony and on personal experience and things like that. Yeah. But all of a sudden,
yeah, when it comes to Christians, nope, you're not allowed to have it.
Yeah, now we restrict our epistemology to the point where not even basic science could get through, because the fact is scientism doesn't even work for basic science. Think about, my boys really love dinosaurs. So think about the art of paleontology. Or even to make it more recent, just archaeology, whether it's ancient archaeology or like 3 years ago for the 100th anniversary of the National Park System. We took a big tour throughout the country, and we traveled from my hometown, where the Lewis and Clark expedition began, all the way up through Montana, headwaters of the Missouri, across Utah and Idaho to Washington, to the Columbia Gorge, to the ocean. We followed the Lewis and Clark Trail, listening to Undaunted Courage on the Audible the whole way.
That's cool.
And there's times where like they'd have these signs and they'd say, how do you know Lewis and Clark stayed here? One of my kids was like, could they just like put up a sign and charge us? I'm like, oh man, so they talk about, the way that sort of, forensic science works, where they dig into the ground, they find lead droppings from making bullets, they test that, they get a lead isotope signature, then they compare that to batches that were delivered to this place that Lewis and Clark bought from. I mean, it's like, that's not in a beaker. You can't titrate that. That's more like Sherlock Holmes kind of stuff.
Yeah, and then they're going to turn around and use inference to the best explanation, or abduction, to weigh whether this hypothesis is the correct one, or theory, because they don't want to use hypothesis anymore now. Not the scientists, I mean the internet infidels that want to, and they're going to say, you're going to use philosophy to go, well, which of these two am I going to go with? It just boggles my mind how we can't use all these different things now, and the misunderstanding, the fundamental misunderstanding of the sciences and how they work. And
especially in theoretical physics, where so much of it's just, very, very. I mean, I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong, but they are reasoning very abductively, very much in a Sherlock Holmesian kind of way.
Yep.
And whether it's, U.S. history, archaeology, paleontology, theoretical physics, particle physics, scientists rely on inference to the best explanation. They rely on their human intuition about what is more likely than what. They rely on the faculty of insight to be able to see connections between things. They are relying on testimony, experience, inference to the best explanation, all exactly the same things that Richard Swinburne does in The Existence of God.
I got that one over there.
So it's like, that's kind of why, I don't know, maybe, the cover of this old 80s tract has a scientist on it, because it's like, on the one hand, there's this perverted concept of reason, as if the only way to like scientifically verify something is microscopy. Yeah. Like there's something, people are fascinated for some reason by microscopy. But notice this, that not so much in microscopy, but certainly in telescopy, you're not even like looking at something. You're taking measurements, of the red shift, and you're feeding that into a computer and doing calculations and saying, okay, well, what could account for this? It's very much a piecemeal, cumulative case reason. There's a couple of things I can actually even suggest on reading this. A friend of mine at St. Louis University wrote a book called I think it's called Discovering the Top Quark. Okay. And a really good friend of mine studied with this Kent Staley, and then a friend of mine did his dissertation with Kent Staley, Aaron Cobb, who's an amazing philosopher. And it's the story of the discovery of the top quark. And if you think that's, somebody looking through a microscope, that's not how quarks are found, my friend. You got to really put two and two together, as it were. And also atheist John Ehrman has he has some books and articles on how he's like, I'm not a Christian myself or even a theist, but what they're doing is the same thing that theoretical physicists are doing. I mean, you're making complex inferences about the unseen from the seen.
Yep. It's exactly right. You're just drawing inferences from the data. It strikes me when somebody wants to object to the Kalam as an example and say that's just purely philosophical and you can't use it. Like, wait. No, the premises are supported by we're making inferences of scientific data, like you mentioned the redshift, to come to these conclusions about the beginning of the universe. So no, it's not just purely philosophical. Again, not that there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah, not that that would even matter.
Right, because it doesn't. But it's
a logically valid argument. The
right.
premises are either true or they're not. So.
Right, exactly, one way or the other. And it just astounds me that they don't understand that. And it shows that the level of misunderstanding or naivete. It just shows me where they're at.
Yeah, the average internet atheist is utterly ignorant of how science is actually practiced. And here's the other thing. I kind of made a vow to not use the word science because there's no such thing as science. There are the sciences. There's biology, chemistry, physics, but there's no such thing as science.
Right.
Even within, there's no one thing that includes archaeology, physical chemistry, and the study of dark matter. I mean, there's no one thing that has all that.
Right, which all stemmed at one point from philosophy anyways.
It's called natural philosophy.
Yeah. So, which strikes me. Do you have time to take questions? I mean, I'll keep
Absolutely.
you all day.
I love viewer questions. This is kind of my favorite part, actually.
So let's see here. I asked them. I said, "Hey, send in questions. Go ahead, guys, and send those in now." I'm looking to see. I asked them to put a Q in front so I could recognize it. So I'm just waiting to see them. They're all chit chatting in the side chat. So one thing I love about our viewers, they're so awesomely friendly, and greet one another.
I've got a chapter coming out soon in a book that's it's a history of philosophy in the 20th century.
Oh, sweet!
It's the Cambridge History of Philosophy in the 20th Century, and my chapter's on philosophy of religion in the 20th century. And because the early 20th century started out with such hardcore scientism and logical positivism, I went back and read all the classics of logical positivism and all the original responses. And it was so interesting. It was just dogmatism. They didn't. So I'm going to make a fairly bold claim. It is approximately true that nobody ever gave a single reason for believing logical positive. It was just a dogma. It's like they just started it, and then everybody played along. They excluded Christians from academia, and it was like, there you go.
And correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't it self-refuting, or was that?
In its standard form, I believe it's self-refuting. Yeah, because you can't. It's neither true by definition nor is it empirically verifiable. Yeah. Now they can try to say it's true by definition. There's a move there, but it's pretty desperate, and they all ended up abandoning it. And it's just unbelievable to me how long after these guys abandoned that view that you still see it among internet atheists. I don't have an explanation for why they're
it so almost seems and I don't want to accuse them of being dishonest, so my only other move is to then just say that they're not up to date, which strikes me. Yeah,
they're like, I think A.J. Ayer pretty much abandoned it. I have to go back and read the distance in time between the writing of an article and when it finally gets published is so long that a lot of times I'm like, I can't remember what I said. I'll have to go look it up. I can't remember I did the corrections and proofs a couple of months ago, so that means that the book's probably going to be out in the spring. But I mean, it's like these guys are 50, 60, 70 years out of date.
Yeah, that paper I'm going to send uses 11,000 words and rough almost. Most of it's appendix because I had to put all the support material in there so that people reading it would understand where I was coming from. And I can't remember half of that, or I did a paper on fideism when you were talking about that earlier, and I'm going through my head trying to remember. I'm like, I'd have to go back and read it. And that's just a few months ago.
I forget things that I've written. Like I completely forgot that Jerry Walls and I wrote a chapter on evil together for a handbook on... There's either the Rutledge Handbook on Rutledge. I think it was the Rutledge Handbook on Theism. Yeah. Okay. I think it's the Rutledge Handbook of Theism or the Oxford Handbook of Theism, one of those. And Jerry Walls and I wrote a chapter on the problem of evil. I just forgot it existed. And then I was reading something and somebody quoted it and I was like, oh yeah. And then I went back. I loved it. Honestly, I went back and read it and I loved it.
I'm going to have to check these out.
If you'll remind me, I'll send you a link to the chapter because
thanks, bro.
I had not looked at it in ages, and it's another one of those that's in a really expensive handbook. And I'm like, gosh, I really enjoyed it. And so thank you, previous Trent, for doing that, because current Trent was really delighted to find that.
Amen. So I got a question here from Corrence Chandler. He's all these folks are awesome. His question is justified true belief still valid in light of the Gettier problem? And I know you have a relationship with Gettier.
Yeah, he's my philosophical grandfather. So I was taught by folks that he was taught by, and academia is very, very into the lineages. So
yeah.
People tend to know if there's somebody big in their background. They make sure to keep track of that. So the justified. So let me just for some listeners say real quick what that is.
Okay.
So there's a point at which people would basically say that knowledge was justified true belief when you believe something and it's also true, and you believe it for good reasons. That's knowledge. But then Bertrand Russell himself had actually pointed out that this is not always the case, and then Edmund Gettier, a professor at University of Massachusetts, in 1963 published a paper that sort of gave several examples and analyzed the structure of it. And he said, actually, sometimes you can have justified true belief and it's not knowledge. So it's sort of like, so you could look out into a field, see what appeared to be a sheep.
I was just going to use that one.
And come to the very rational belief that there's a sheep. And it could turn out that that's true, but only because you were looking at a sheepdog and there's a sheep behind a rock. Yep. So your belief would be justified because you went on exactly how it appeared to be. It would be true because there is a sheep in the field, and you believed it. You believed there's a sheep in that field. But few people would call that knowledge. And I think that the answer to the Gettier problem came pretty quickly and obviously, which is that's true. It's sort of an accident that you're correct. There's too much luck involved, right. And so when you add, all you need to add to justified true belief is something that guarantees that it's just not luck. And there's a lot of different ways to formalize that, and that can be difficult to nail that down precisely. But basically, I like to say that knowledge is justified true belief that is not too lucky.
Oh, okay. I like that. Yeah, because it seemed to me, I had posed this a while back to my father and brother. We were standing around at a holiday in the kitchen. I said, now, I want a layman's interpretation of this, guys. If we were in the car and I said, look, there's a sheep over there in that field, and in this case, and then we figured out as we come around maybe a corner and we see it's a sheepdog for whatever reason, the actual sheep is there, and I said, I was still right, they'd both go baloney. They wouldn't use that word,
right?
But,
yeah.
They called, and I said, no, I'm justified. Yeah, exactly. I said, no, but I said in the field, and I feel like sometimes as philosophers, I shouldn't put myself in that category. I'd like to, but that we get too into the weeds with the semantics, but we don't look at it from a pragmatic approach like that and go, that's
philosophers can be pretty weaselly.
Yeah, exactly. And so I kind of go, your layman wouldn't accept that. They
not for a second. Now, there are studies that show that the degree to which you're willing to affirm that that's not knowledge does sometimes vary by culture. And some people have tried to say that it's culturally relative, but I don't think those studies hold up very well.
And it could be, but and what I would say is in English, as Americans, when I said in the field, they knew, being that there was only one thing there, what I was talking about. And that's the other thing is, it seemed to me that the thing that it forgets when looking at it from an academic perspective is what it's like when you're actually in the situation, that everyone there, maybe through a gesture or for whatever reason, knows what I was referring to. So they would just say I was wrong, period.
Yeah,
carte blanche.
And even if you wanted to, and another option is to grant that it's this really crummy, low-grade knowledge, call it lucky knowledge, which isn't what we're looking for. So either way, it's either not knowledge or it's some sort of like low-grade, lucky knowledge that doesn't have much value. So that's the Gettier problem for justified true belief, and I think it's not a big deal because I think you just add a clause that you add one more clause. It's not lucky. Now, there's many different ways in which it could be not lucky. If you hold to a view called reliabilism, you could say it's not lucky because it's reliable in the right sort of way. If you're a proper functionalist like Plantinga, you could say what makes it not lucky is the result of proper function. If you're a sort of old-fashioned foundationalist like me, What can make it not lucky is just that in the good cases of justified true belief that are knowledge, there's a systematic connection. There's a linkage between you and the world that doesn't sort of have any gaps in it. And in that case, there's an obvious sort of gap where the truth maker is over here and your perceptual chain is over here. It's like it's not really, the chain doesn't really link up. And so I would say it's not properly based or whatever. So either it's not knowledge or it's worthless knowledge or bad or somehow flawed knowledge. So the key, I think, is I don't even need the word knowledge for my epistemology ever.
I like that.
I just need probability stuff. Like I want to know how likely is it? And it doesn't have to be a number. It can be what are called qualitative probabilities. Like it could be like very probable, extremely probable, somewhat probable, things like that. But I don't even need the notion of knowledge for anything. I can completely get by without the notion of knowledge and just use probability talk.
And that seems to me to be the way the world actually functions with it. That's why when I started hearing I think the first exposure I really had to you was with the debate with Tom Jump, and I was like, what? And that was a great debate. Those of you who haven't seen it, go back and watch that, because not only did you do a great job, but I felt like because it was about epistemology and all of this and our justification as Christians, where you were able to get in there and really dig deep, where unfortunately I haven't seen the one recently with Schuyler, but the debate with Aaron Ra, it's just a lot of pejoratives on his end. He kept sniping.
And he doesn't. His concept, his definition he gave of evidence was just ridiculous.
Oh, it was. Yeah, he
it
moved
wouldn't
the
work for
goalposts.
Science.
Yeah, right.
It wouldn't work for anything. And these debates are all linked on my YouTube channel, Recovering Reason, as well as an analysis of the Tom Jump debate, in which I go into a little bit of epistemology instruction, and then I'll have the analysis of the Aaron Ra debate. Hopefully soon, and the Schuyler debate's going to take a long time the review of it's going to take a long time to edit because he couldn't stay on topic for like 5 seconds. So, and I'm going to document that he kept changing what he was saying, and he kept putting words in my mouth and saying I was saying things I wasn't. So I'm going to take the time to go back and say, okay, here's Schuyler fictionalizing about what I said at this time. Now let's go back. Like here's an actual clip at this time in this seconds, and say here's what I actually said, and you can see they don't match up. So that one's going to take a long time to edit. But the Aaron Ra videos, not the response video, the analysis video, is not going to take too long to edit, because I'm basically going to focus on 2 fundamental fallacies. His overall fallacy that he committed over and over and over and over again, and then analyze his definition of knowledge, which was his definition of evidence was just hilarious. But you can watch all the debates on Recovering Reason.
I'm gonna check that out because I can't wait to see I did see the analysis for the first one, and that was great too. Same thing, because you get into epistemology, and I'm like yeah.
Yeah, and this is something I think it's important for Christians to do, to have a sort of, to think about the method. Before you jump into an argument, think about the method an argument the method with which you ought to argue, the method with which you ought to form beliefs. Okay? And so they should learn things like if you don't know what inference to the best explanation is, there's a book by James Sire published by IVP Press, great Christian intellectual press, called Why Should Anybody Believe Anything at All? It's the most fundamental epistemology book ever published. And so if you're starting from scratch and you want to see it from a Christian standpoint, it's wonderful. It's called Why Should Anybody Believe Anything at All? And it lays out a methodology of belief formation that works across the board, that's essentially inference of the best explanation. And inference of the best explanation is basically just Bayesian probability reasoning without the probabilities. It does the same thing, it takes the same features, and it just treats them qualitatively rather than quantitatively. And so I really recommend you read that book and really internalize it and think, okay, here is how we form beliefs, and if this is how we form beliefs, then that's going to give you a method for this is how I have to argue and try to persuade somebody else to believe the same. Because I'm sort of reconstructing for them my process of reasoning. And at the end of the day, all you can do for anybody is reconstruct your process of reasoning and hope it catches, hope they see the insights, hope they catch the insights and see the things that you see. And you can't do more than that. But if you want to really, you'll be better at verbalizing that process if you've made a study of the process of belief formation itself. And the best way to do that is to read this book, Why Believe Anything at All, and also, Swinburne's book, The Existence of God, has a chapter on the nature of explanation and the justification of explanation. So the first 3 chapters of this book, but especially chapters 2 and 3, are actually giving you a method of belief formation. They're saying here's how rational beliefs are formed, and then in these 2 popular books, he doesn't spend as much time explicitly expositing the belief formation method that is basically what epistemology is about.
Right.
But there is one chapter in this book, chapter 2, is called How We Explain Things. I beg your listeners to get this book and read chapter 2, How We Explain Things, independently of the rest of it. Don't just jump in and say, oh, I'm going to get another way to defend my beliefs. Don't start with that. Start with the thought, I want to meditate on how beliefs are formed in a rational way. And beliefs are formed when the propositions that are the contents of those beliefs feature in explanations of data in the world. Another word for evidence is data.
Yep.
There are data in the world that stand in need of explanation. And when a belief functions in a crucial way as a part of an explanation of those observed data, that gives your belief credibility.
That makes sense.
So I highly recommend reading that chapter for its own right and really coming to think about that belief formation process.
Awesome. I have those. In fact, I've ordered some of these other ones recently that you recommended on other channels, so I can't wait for them to get here. There was another question Corinth asked, and those of you that are asking questions, thank you. You guys are talking a lot, which I love, in the chat, but I have to track down the question, so forgive me. And I'm being selfish and asking, I'm hogging Trent all of myself, so sorry about that, guys. Is the Cartesian solution to skepticism analogous to that of presuppositionalists? He asks, and if so, in what ways do they differ? And if not, in what ways are they the same?
Well, to answer that fully would take a long time
to unpack. Yeah.
But no, I don't think it's presuppositionalism at all. I mean, in a way, it's kind of the opposite, because he's giving you an argument for God's existence, and there's no presumption there at all. So Descartes, Cartesian refers to Descartes. René Descartes, a French mathematician, scientist, and philosopher. He died in 1650, so he spanned that 1600s bridge, and he was a brilliant mathematician. Y equals mx plus b, that's called the Cartesian plane. He came up with that. Very, very brilliant man, very brilliant philosopher. But he said. He thought about how everything that was a matter of sense experience could be fake. Like, just think Matrix kind of stuff. Or if people don't read the Matrix, I don't know. So few people have seen the Matrix. That's the thing for guys your and my age. It's like, if you don't have the Matrix to refer to, I guess. He said, look, you're dreaming. He said, dreams can appear real. And I'm a lucid dreamer, and sometimes it takes me a while to shake that off and realize that I've been dreaming. So you can, while you're dreaming, everything seems real to you. You sort of believe it's real at the time. So, we can't infallibly know that we're not dreaming right now. And then, so he tries to peel it back and say, okay, well, what can I know for sure? Well, I know that I exist. I can't doubt that I exist, because doubting is a form of thinking, and thinking requires a thinker. Therefore, one thing I cannot doubt is that I exist. But then he goes on to say, well, who is this thinker? What are the properties of this thinker? I can conceive of myself not existing, so I'm a contingent being. There has to be something greater. There has to be a source of The idea of perfection, all this. I know I'm imperfect because I've got these doubts. So there has, and the idea of perfection can't come from an imperfect being, which really he owes to Augustine. A lot of Descartes' views are actually cribbed from Augustine. He just doesn't want to admit it. But what Descartes, so Descartes gives you an argument for the existence of God. He's just not appealing to empirical evidence, and there's one sort of rock bottom, inescapable thing, but it's I exist. It's not a presupposition in the sense that he's just it's a fundamental assumption. He's saying I can't doubt it because doubt is a form of thinking, and thinking requires a thinker. So it's inescapable. It's not an assumption or a presumption. It's inescapable. But unfortunately, Descartes fails to notice that all of these things are things that an evil demon could make you believe. It's not like you couldn't devise a pill or a potion or a spell that could make somebody get mathematical beliefs wrong, right? Right. You could absolutely we make mathematical mistakes. We know what it's like to think that we've proved a mathematical equation and then realize, oh gosh, I was wrong. Okay, so that experience as of having proved a mathematical theorem could be applied to anything with enough, either with a hypnotist or a pill or an evil demon, you could make somebody believe that 1 + 1 = 5. And so really Descartes wasn't skeptical enough because you could easily have doubts about those things. So the whole Cartesian project is off the rails, but certainly nothing resembling presuppositionalism there, because he gives arguments that start from secular premises. I may have missed something that the questioner wanted there, but I mean that's a dead end.
Cogito ergo sum. There you go. That's the only thing I could think to add to that.
Yep, I think therefore I am.
That was excellent, and it always strikes me as odd. I laugh when I see atheists using Descartes to say we can doubt things. I go, he used that to formulate a pretty good argument for God, right? Like that was just a foundation where he said, yeah, I know I exist, and then built up from there. And oh, by the way, I know this being God exists, and I don't know.
Yeah,
I just find it funny.
It's a plausible argument, and Descartes has a plausible ontological argument. I think Leibniz is the best of the rationalists for sure. I think, but yeah, I mean, you give me almost anything, and we can get. We can make some distance from there to God.
Yeah, hey, that's it. Somebody had asked, speaking of Leibniz, about the I think it was the ontological argument. So, brother who asked that, I'm looking for the question again. I think it was the ontological, and the brother asked, do you think it's a good argument for God? I believe I'm trying.
Yeah, I think the ontological argument is sound. I think it's valid and has true premises. But I don't think it's usually. I think usually it's not a good idea to use it in an apologetics context, because I don't think it's very persuasive.
Doesn't have the force.
Yeah, because it's like you have to be open-minded to a certain extent to understand it.
Yep.
Because it is, it can sound like a trick, and so if your brain wants it to be a trick, then you can see it that way. So you have to be open-minded to even understand it. But I think the ontological argument, as it's set forth by Aquinas and by Charles Hartshorne, actually has my favorite version, and Christian philosopher Robert Mary Hugh Adams has several versions. I think it's a totally valid argument, and I think the premises are true. I think so. The simplest version of the modal ontological argument is that God's existence, since God's a necessary being, he either exists necessarily or it is impossible that he exists. So think about mathematical truths. It's kind of interesting. Mathematical truths are all either necessary or impossible. There's no middle ground. So 1 + 1 = 2 is necessary. 1 + 1 = 3 is impossible. So so within the category of claims to necessary truth, those claims are either necessarily true or impossible. And so if God is defined as a necessary being, such a being either exists of necessity or is impossible. There's no accidental non-existence of a necessary being. It either exists or it's impossible.
Yeah.
And so that gives you your second premise, that it's possible that God exists. And that's all it takes to give you your conclusion that God necessarily exists. Now, is it possible that God exists? Well, I think it's pretty weak thing to say. So it's like,
right.
Like the burden of proof is on somebody to show that it's not possible, frankly.
Yeah.
I mean, when we make statements that something is the case, we bear the burden of proof. But if we say that something possibly is the case, we get the benefit of the doubt. And so
right.
I think there's also, for structural reasons, I think you can see the possibility that God exists. And so, yeah, I think it's a sound argument, a logically valid argument with true premises, but not very persuasive, because it's like you kind of either see it or you don't,
Yeah, and speaking of which, burden of proof. This is one thing I've noticed a lot of people seem to get wrong, and I'd love to hear your explanation, because it seems like, and again, I hate to keep throwing the poor atheists under the bus. I don't mean to, guys. I'm sorry. And
I
it's not
think
all
the atheists are driving their little scooters under the bus by day.
Yeah, by themselves. Yeah,
they're on their tiny little, epistemic scooters of scientism.
With no helmet.
Then they're driving themselves under the bus like a bunch of lemmings.
Yeah, well, that's that's a great analogy, because the lemming part is just following the ones that are doing it.
Yeah, they all do the same thing. It's like they're interchangeable.
Yeah, well, I've had some brother that will cut and paste stuff and throw it on in responses on our videos. Yeah, I realized they were doing it because I'd respond to one and all of a sudden get 5 more with different accounts almost immediately on a video where that had no responses, and I'm like, what is going on? Anyway, with long responses, just seconds after I'd responding to me, just seconds after I'd posted something, I'm like, yeah, there's something not right here. But the question on burden of proof is, what, from a philosophical or epistemological standpoint, how do you? It seems to me, and please correct me, that it doesn't matter whether the claim is positive or negative. You bear the burden of proof. Makes no difference whatsoever. Right. That's what I thought. In other words,
utterly irrelevant.
You say, I have a dog, and I say, no, you don't. Now the burden of proof is on me. Even though you made the initial claim, if I don't ask for some sort of support for that, as soon as I negate it and say, no, you don't, I've made a claim that something is or is not the case. Therefore, I now bear the burden. Is that correct?
Yeah. All claims.
That's okay. Yep.
Are capable of bearing a burden of proof.
That's what I thought.
It depends on what Bayesians would call the prior probability.
Ah.
So think about that idea of the balance. And so imagine a center here, and you've got a plank on top that is 3 feet. That's a 4 foot long plank.
Okay.
And the fulcrum comes at 1 foot in, which means it's going to have 3 times the amount on that side, right? Okay. So it's going to go down like that, and it's going to take the weight of 3 of those units just to get it back. You'd have to add 2 more of those units to get it back to even out.
Okay.
Right? And so that's analogous to the prior probability. If somebody says they rolled a die and got an ace on the first roll, they bear the burden of proof, because that's a priori unlikely. The prior odds on that are low. Okay? If somebody says they rolled, if they say, well, I rolled a number that is either prime or even. Let's see how many. If there's 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So if they say they rolled a prime number, well, then they get the benefit of the doubt, because a prime number is more likely than not, given it. Now, when we leave the realm of dice and cards and games of chance, we depend on our background knowledge of a situation. So if I tell you, hey, I've got a pickup right there, well, you're going to think, okay, he's a dude in Texas, Yeah. And I've almost grabbed the camera to show you.
I can see something out the window straight ahead, but I don't know if that's what you're talking about or not.
I'm in love with it's a Dodge Ram mega cab with a cattle guard bumper on top. I'm in love with this truck. Now, so that's the sort of claim where the odds are, that's not an unusual claim, right? It's like, yeah, okay, that's plausible. So there's not going to be much burden of proof there at all, if any. If I say I've got an elephant in my yard, that's very unlikely.
Right.
And so now, note that this looks structurally similar to miracle claims, right?
Well, that's where I was going.
hear
Yeah.
atheists say, "Oh, well, you're making these extraordinary claims that require extraordinary evidence."
Yeah.
Yes and no. I mean, on the one hand, sure, that's fine. I've got no problem with that because we've got extraordinary evidence, and they just need to familiarize themselves with how quickly multiple converging testimony adds up. There's a paper by Dan Bonavac on that. There's a paper by John DePoe on that, and both of these guys and Tim McGrew, and they've shown probabilistically that independent testimony adds up really fast. Just like we saw before, you with one die, rolling an ace is 1/6. With two, it's 2/6 or 1/3. With three, it's 1/2. It grows when you have independent sources. It grows fast. So when you have these concurring, testimonies to the resurrection or whatever, they grow pretty quickly, and so we can have extraordinary evidence for that. Also, the thing they constantly miss, atheists who make this extraordinary evidence claim, is how extraordinary a claim is depends on whether or not there's a God,
Right.
and on what else you know about the individual. So Swinburne's very good in this book and in the book that it's based on. This is sort of an abbreviation and sort of translation down a little bit of his book, The Resurrection of God Incarnate. He's very good about pointing out, look, if there's a God, which I've already argued there is, and if the claim to resurrection is about this guy who we've already studied and know to have been a great teacher, a sane person, made messianic claims, etc., then the claim to a resurrection isn't as extraordinary as it first looks. If I say, hey, my cousin Larry rose from the dead, right? You're like, I don't know who that is and why I should think that that's likely. But we already know some things about Jesus, and we've got theism in the background, and these miracle claims are just not that extraordinary. If there's a God that can create the entire cosmos out of nothing, then reversing a local biological process is no big deal. Whether it's changing water into wine, parting the Red Sea, I mean, it's trivial for God to do.
If I can throw in one here that I had read somebody, I thought I posted a response, apparently it never took, but to saying he couldn't accept Balaam's donkey talking because he had no prior whatever. And I said, well, here, let me throw it out this way. He affirms science and all these scientism. And I said, do you think in however long you want to guess, 20, 100 years, science will be able to build translators for dogs or other animals that we can understand what they're saying? And of course the answer is going to have to be, well, yeah. I mean, he's going to more than likely have to say, yeah, I believe we can. We can already sort of interpret, if I remember correctly, dolphin sounds, or I don't remember what it is. Now, if that's possible, why is it that God couldn't have maybe made Balaam understand the donkey as opposed to making the donkey speak? Because, I mean, granted, could he have made the donkey speak? Sure. But,
easily.
Yeah, easily. But let's just go the route and say, for whatever reason, he decided not to. Could he have just been able to make Balaam understand?
Yeah, he could have just put the thought into his head.
And so, particularly if he's a metaphysical being, a non-physical being, how hard would that be?
It's trivially easy. And how it is that atheists miss this so consistently is beyond me. I mean, it's just look, either there's a God or there's not. Let's have that argument. Yeah. I'll do that argument all day long.
Yeah.
If there is a God, and if we've got this guy Jesus making these claims to be God and validating those claims in various ways, then God raising him from the dead to validate his message is not that extraordinary a claim.
Yeah, it's just not. I mean,
and also here's another respect in which it's not true that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If I were to tell you that I once hit a hole in one, or that I once saw somebody hit a hole in one, you'd be like, "Oh, cool." You wouldn't be like, "Nope, sorry, I don't believe it." Right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes extraordinary things happen, and all it takes is somebody to observe them.
Yep.
And so if people saw Jesus raised from the dead, and we've got no reason to doubt their testimony, then guess what? We've got good reason to believe Jesus rose from the dead, because somebody saw him die and then later saw him alive.
Yep.
And so that's just, so in one sense, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but which is not a problem. And in another sense, they just don't, because no matter how extraordinary an event, somebody can be there to witness it.
Yeah.
And if we have witnesses to something extraordinary, then, and we can't, we don't have a reason to doubt them, then that's fine. The harder, when you've got people sometimes then bring up, what about people who've claimed to see Bigfoot or claimed to see, aliens or things like that?
Or ghosts.
Well, I'm like, let's bring it on.
Yeah, exactly. Show me the evidence. I'll look at it.
Take them one by one. I'll go through as many as you want.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, and it's frustrating. And the other thing too with that extraordinary evidence thing, guys, if there's any other questions that we didn't get to, forgive me. You guys are awesome. You've already posted like 454 comments, so it's hard for me to pick out the questions. So throw them back in there if I didn't ask it, and I'll get you.
And I will need to.
You got to bolt soon. All right.
Bolt fairly soon, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just say that it's frustrating because I have to. A lot of times these things are phrased in a way where I have to unpack even what they mean. In other words, what do they mean by extraordinary? Do you mean the probability is low, therefore you need, more data than not? What do you mean by that? So many times, a lot of this stuff is framed in almost emotional language, if I could say it that way.
Yeah. And that's why I like to translate everything into the probability language,
makes sense.
Because then the claim becomes improbable events require special evidence. Wrong. You can see somebody. Yep. Hit a hole in one, and that just settles it, know?
Yeah.
Now you could say there are events, if you could get down to the quantum level and say, there are these paradoxes about, when lottery numbers are pulled. They can be so wildly improbable that you're like, is it more probable that I would make a mistake in what I saw than that these numbers would be pulled up ahead of time? So there are some interesting cases, but yeah, I mean, if I see the lotto balls pulled up and put in their little slots, I can look right there, and it was 1 in 20 million or whatever that it would be there, but nevertheless, there it is, and it's not very extraordinary to verify this claim of a very improbable event. You look at it.
Yeah,
and that can happen with the resurrection too. The claim is that these guys looked at Jesus alive after they looked at him dead.
Right, exactly.
So there's nothing extraordinary about that.
Right. It's that was your response to recently Tom Jump, I think, and I thought, yeah, that's exactly right. There's no need to require anything. It's just, I mean, to me, now granted, people aren't rising from the dead on their own, but we have people coming back from death through modern medicine. So if we can do it through modern medicine, why is it that we're saying that, again,
an omnipotent being is not going to have a problem bringing somebody back from the dead. And if the person in question happens to be of the race of the chosen people who made messianic claims, et cetera, well then we've got antecedent reason for God to either utterly discredit that person or validate their message.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that.
That's Richard Swinburne all the way.
Oh man, I got to get in. I've got several of his books. I've got, I don't know, I can't even see them right now, but I've got them. They're there. I got to get into them. I've had so much reading to do for school. Anyway, all right, guys. I don't see any other questions, and I'm going to let Brother Trent go. Brother, thank you so much for staying for so long. First of all, I really appreciate it for answering our questions.
Yes, it's my pleasure.
And I hope that you'll consider coming back again to talk about what we had talked about with addiction and whatnot.
Absolutely.
I know that'd be
I'd be glad to.
Huge blessing. Let me think. I guess that's it. And real quick, I see the argument still going, guys. Dogs or cats? Which way are you going to lean?
Well,
if you had to, I know it's tough.
Very tough in this household. I'm always a dog man first.
Yeah.
But we have bunches of cats, and is the kitten inside right now? Where is she? She's in with Sam. We have the cutest little kitten right now. She's named Betsy. We rescue cats and dogs and other critters. And so we were at the 4th of July celebration downtown Waco, and we were sitting out on some rocks right on the edge of the river. And I looked back at my kids. They were a little behind me. And I noticed that the rock that my youngest son was sitting on, a little pair of eyes peeping out from under there with the reflection of the fireworks lighting them up. And I'm like, I think there's a kitten under there. And so he coaxed her out and got her.
That's cool.
Then we brought her home, and That's new kitten Betsy, and she's super cute. I've got lots of Instagram pictures of her, but I was going to put her on camera, but she's cavorting about the house and nobody can find her right now. But definitely love cats, but my companions are really dogs.
Yeah, they're more social. I'm with you there. We've had a couple cats and a ferret, and we've had all kinds of pets. And, yeah, we've adopted the same thing. When I was in the military, Erica will tell you a story sometime. And for those of you who wanted to see her on camera, she loves to be ready and do up her hair and everything, and that's exhausting. So that's why she's not on, but she'll be on in future events. Again, brother, thank you so much. I really can't thank you enough. To me, I just really wanted to talk to you, and I appreciate everything.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Best of luck in your ministry. Keep it up, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Okay, thanks, brother. Hey, God bless.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
God bless.
All right, you guys, we'll see you soon, and we'll talk to you, those of you that are in the Patreon group in our thing tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern, whatever the Eastern date time. I forget. Nate will tell you what the EDT is. Anyway, yep. If you guys have any questions that I can answer, you can throw them in there real quick if I missed. I know there was one question about books, and the reason I didn't answer that is because we had discussed several books. So for the brother or sister that asked that, the only reason I didn't ask Trent that was he had given a tremendous amount of recommendations. I will try to type them up and put them in the description down below. All right, so you guys take care. Thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate it, and I will see Eastern Daylight Time. That's it. Thank you, Nate. And you guys are awesome as always. I've been Sean. You've been wonderful, and we will see you guys tonight in the private hangout at 8 p.m. That's for the mods and those on our Patreon group. And we really appreciate all your support and everything. And I'm taking forever to get off because I love talking to you guys so much. All right. Love y'all. Take care. God bless.